Hey guys, what's up? I'm Gavin, Schall. That's Alex Wolfe. We are the boys from Locked On Knicks here to tell you a little bit about the Knicks if you somehow don't know a ton about them going into the postseason. Alex, the weird thing about this Knicks team is, for one that's been probably one of the five best teams in the NBA over the last month and a half, at least in terms of net rating, people don't really know a ton about a lot of players on the team. So can you let everyone know what the Knicks rotation is going to look like this postseason, and maybe even who some of the key role guys are? Because I feel like it's Julius Randle, and then you don't really hear anyone else getting talked about.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's get rid of the obvious ones first, right? Julius Randle, all-star player. Probably, I was about to say all-NBA. It's not sure yet, but almost assuredly he's going to be an all-NBA player, be it third team, second team. Maybe there's a chance at first team. I don't know, but I think he's going to be an all-NBA player, probably the most improved player in the NBA this year. Became just one of six players ever to average 24 points, 10 rebounds, 6 assists per game over the course of an entire season. Funny enough, was joined by Nikola Jokic this same season, but fantastic player. He's their engine in all aspects. He's the guy that, other teams have to game plan for. We've seen, he's pretty much matchup proof at this point. Teams throw doubles at him and he finds ways to pass out of them and find open shooters. Teams throw single coverage at him and he just eats whoever alive, unless it's like Anthony Davis. So very, very tough cover. Then you got RJ Barrett, youngest player on the Knicks, also their second best player, I think. A really good scorer, has improved a ton shooting the ball this year, way more than people thought he was going to, I think. And, he's definitely going to be an X factor in these playoffs, and it'll be a good, initial test for him in just his second year in the NBA to see how he does. Then beyond that, you've got Reggie Bullock, probably their top role player, really great three-point shooter on volume. Alec Burks coming off the bench, another great, isolation scorer and a guy who can create off the dribble and stuff like that. Derrick Rose has been really for the last, 2 months now, however long it's been since they got him, really been one of their key players coming off the bench and then being a closer for them late in stretches of games, particularly during their win streak and their great stretch of play to end the season. He was really great with that. There's a number of other guys too, Gavin, but I'll throw it to you at risk of hogging all of them. And there's also, I think going to be a controversy for the Knicks going into the playoffs as far as the starting point guard spot.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good lead in. Elfrid Payton, who I think nationally people might be a little bit confused by the vitriol he gets, and people just say, hey, he's been the starting point guard all year, and the Knicks have been way better than anyone expected. But it's been pretty consistent that they've been a much better team with Rose or quickly on the floor. And the last week or two, it feels like things have really, really gone downhill for him, where the one thing he was doing really well was getting to the basket and finishing. That's almost gone away. Allegedly, he plays mostly for his defense. That has not really been a thing. He looks disinterested at points on that end. And of course, the usual stuff with him where he really can't shoot the basketball. But that brings us to some of the Knicks' key bench pieces who could play a significant role, particularly if Peyton's out of the rotation. You got to look at Emmanuel quickly, a guy who, in terms of his advanced statistics, probably is a case to be the rookie of the year, even if he won't get a lot of consideration on that front. He's just been incredible for the Knicks as a range shooter and someone who increasingly is starting to hold his own on the defensive end. Obi Toppin, a big question for New York, the 8th pick in last year's draft. By and large, a disappointing rookie season, but someone who has gotten to a point where it feels like he's a solid NBA contributor off the bench. Will he play significant minutes in the playoffs, or will he be someone who's played off the court? And then Alec Burks, who just returned for New York, and has had a number of monster games. I don't think they go 3-0 these last 3 games, which they needed to clinch that 4 seed. Without Burks, he was a monster for them down the stretch, getting to the rim, hitting threes, even getting some run as the nominal point guard for the Knicks. A lineup you could see New York go to if Peyton is eventually removed from the rotation. There's a lot of other key pieces that we're not going to get to, but maybe we'll talk about them a little bit on the tail end of this, Alex, just getting into how deep the Knicks are. But that gets us to our next question. What do you feel is the Knicks' biggest strength, and what do you feel is their biggest weakness heading into their first playoffs in 8 seasons?
I think the biggest strength is the fact that they've been playing playoff-style basketball all year. I think that the big thing that has been sort of the staple of how the Knicks play is that they're a tough-nosed defensive team. They slow things down. They're one of the slowest paced teams in the league throughout the year. And, that led to a lot of low scoring affairs, but they did well in those games. They performed really well in games where they held teams under 100 points. And, you saw that reflect in their defensive rating numbers, their net rating numbers. They didn't score a ton themselves, but they held other teams to really low totals too. They also play a pretty rough and tumble brand of basketball. I wouldn't say that they're dirty or foul happy or anything, but they play physical. They're going to be in your teeth the whole game as far as, playing defense. And that's a style that fits really well with the playoffs. Now, the flip side of that, which I would say is probably their biggest weakness, is that they get themselves into these situations where they're in a lot of close games. And although they did great in games where they held their opponents under 100 points, they didn't do very well in games where they were within one possession of their opponents. And that's because the Knicks often have a hard time with finding who that guy is going to be to close games, to make that one shot that you need in a one possession game, whether it's tied or what have you, and just kind of close things out in those final seconds. Randle's great, but he sometimes struggles with that, with finishing those tight game situations. You have Burks, who's a great scorer in the fourth quarter, but doesn't necessarily always hit those shots. RJ Barrett, same deal. There's just Derrick Rose is not necessarily a guy you can rely on for that. So if the Knicks find themselves in a situation with the Hawks where it comes down to a last shot, you could probably count on, if you're the Hawks, you could probably count on Trae Young. And I don't know what his clutch numbers look like, to say for sure, like, yes, I trust him, or yes, I would not trust him. But with Randle, I don't know 100% that he's like that guy yet as far as closing out games. And so if they get into some one possession, real drag out games, that could spell trouble for them, even if it is sort of their style of play.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that the Knicks have won big games against great teams this season. And when you talk about their biggest strengths and weaknesses, I think they're consistently on display against the best teams in the NBA. They play with a certain grittiness and confidence imbued in them by Tom Thibodeau, imbued in them by Julius Randle in the season that he's had. And they feel like they can win those close games. Derrick Rose has been just ridiculous of late in terms of his ability to make big shots, make really high degree of difficulty shots. RJ Barrett has shown no fear in those moments. But to your point, Alex, they sometimes have trouble scoring, but that hasn't been the case in a couple of their biggest wins of the season, which we're going to go over right now. Early in the year, I don't really think it was an announcement that the Knicks were going to be a top 4 seed, because no one was buying into it at the time. And I don't even think people were necessarily disrespecting the Knicks by not buying into it. It was more so that they weren't doing it with consistency. But you saw the flashes of what this team could be when they were playing the best. They buried the Milwaukee Bucks, beat them by 30-plus points because they hit a ton of threes in that game and defended the three-point line extremely well. That continued throughout the season. They finished the year shooting over 39% from three, top 6 in the NBA, holding opponents to 34% from three, top 5 in the NBA. Similar theme against the Boston Celtics. Absolutely kicked their butts. Maybe should have told us more about the Celtics than it even did the Knicks. Got an early 12-point win over the Utah Jazz. And then, of course, Alex, I'll throw it over to you to this, but the big winning streak they just had, recording a myriad of crucial wins over that stretch, and showing that at least when Derrick Rose is healthy, there's a level of consistency and high level of play this team could reach that many didn't expect or see within this group. Yeah,
the big stretch you're talking about there is, 9 straight wins from April 9th until April 24th. It was admittedly a somewhat soft schedule, but even the best teams in the league struggle to beat a soft schedule for 9 straight games. It's tough to win that many games in a row in the NBA. You don't see it happen more than maybe a handful of times every season across the entire league. So the fact that they were able to put that together, and they did beat some quality teams, like Memphis is a play-in team. New Orleans was a team that was pretty dangerous at the time. They sort of faltered down the stretch, but at the time they faced the Knicks, they were very much in play for the play-in. Beat Dallas in that stretch with a pretty convincing win. Fell to Phoenix just by a late flurry by Chris Paul at the end of the streak. And then, proceeded to win 3 more games after that. So ultimately won 12 out of 13 games. That was the stretch that put the Knicks really in consideration for this 4 seed, where they ended up getting, was the fact that they turned it up when they had to, and when the rest of the league was turning it up. Atlanta was getting hot, and Miami was getting hot. Both of them were getting healthy after so long. The Knicks needed to step their play up, and they did that. And they just sort of held serve against their contemporaries where, previously the 4 to 6 seed was roughly 500 teams. And you saw teams like Boston in there as well, Charlotte, but then the cream sort of rose to the top, and the Knicks wound up being the creamiest of the cream, I guess, in that regard. And then the final biggest win of the year, I think, was the late game or the late season game against the Clippers. They won 106-100 on May 9th. That was a real playoff intensity type game. Went right down to the wire, and the Knicks wound up winning it. And, it just kind of showed that was like a real test. The Clippers it was not a super rest day or anything. They were playing to win that game, and they gave the Knicks their best shot, and the Knicks still turned them away and beat them. So I think that's, probably if you're looking for one signature win that proves like these Knicks can win in the playoffs, that's probably the one. As far as the worst losses, we won't dwindle too long on that, but there was a number. There was a couple where they really just came out listless. There was one against San Antonio right before the All-Star break. That was pretty ugly. They lost 119-93. That was not a great one. There was one right after the All-Star break to Milwaukee. They lost 134-101. Also a really ugly game. That was the one at the time where we kind of just said, okay, that wasn't the first game after the All-Star break. There's still, there's different games. We'll worry about those. And then there was, I would say probably the most disencouraging one. They had gone through this stretch where they lost a bunch of close games to, the Nets and the Sixers and stuff by like just one possession, two possessions. And, those were excusable because those are really good teams. But then they lost this inexcusable game to Minnesota on March 31st, where it seemed like, they got out to a huge lead and then just kind of decided we don't have to try anymore. And that was sort of a turning point for them, I think, where they realized, we're good, but we're not that good. We need to still try for all 48 minutes. And I think that game served as sort of a wake up call for them as far as, the level of competition in the NBA that they weren't quite good enough to just kind of do like what the Nets do on some nights and just coast to a win if you get up by 25 against a really bad team. Like you have to play all the way through, at least halfway through the fourth quarter or something, to not let these teams get back into it. So that was a real learning moment for the team. But to move on to our next part of this question or part of this Q&A here, the playoff stakes. So what will happen if the team wins or loses in the playoffs, if they don't get super far, if they get swept? I think the beautiful thing, Gavin, and feel free to disagree with me if you don't agree with this, but I think the great thing with the Knicks right now is that everything is house money. They could get, I mean, it would be disappointing for sure, but it wouldn't threaten anybody's jobs if the Knicks got swept by the Hawks. You would just say, all right, well, this just wasn't the year. You need to get better next year, whatever. Maybe they would look at some adjustments. They would be like, hey, Tibbs, maybe you shouldn't do this, that, or the other. They'd be like, oh, we need more shooting, or we need more this, we need more that. But, nobody's going to lose their job over this. This is not a high tension environment. This is a team that wasn't even supposed to be in the playoffs this year. They were projected by Vegas and many experts to be one of the worst teams in the league. And yet they found themselves in this situation where they're, the 4 seed in the East and probably have a real chance of beating the Hawks. But ultimately I think there's no expectations. I think some people have really talked themselves into a first round win, and I'm certainly rooting for it. I think it might happen, but I don't think that that's the expectation for anyone. And I don't think if that doesn't come to fruition, that's going to like disappoint anybody too much, because everybody's mostly just happy that the Knicks are back. And that includes the front office and ownership and everything else. I don't think anybody's going to really take exception to anything, given the fact that the Knicks actually made the playoffs this year.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. And on an individual level, I was just kind of going through my head, what would the narratives be if specific guys struggled? And Julius Randle, I don't think we'd be calling into question, all right, was this really such a good season for him? Was it a mirage? We'd be like, no, we had 72 games of evidence that this guy is an all-NBA caliber player. And if he has a bad series, it probably means he was exhausted from leading the NBA in minutes the entire year and taking on an incredible workload on a team that, outside of when Derrick Rose has really been rolling these last 20 games, hasn't had that consistent second option. RJ Barrett, if he struggles, we'd say, all right, man, he made a massive, massive jump after his rookie year. He's 20 years old, maybe 21 now. His first playoffs, all right, he'll be fine next time around. Derrick Rose, if he struggled for some reason, we'd say, all right, I mean, what he did for us was great. But look, he was, to your point, found money. The Knicks didn't really give up anything of value for him. And he was a guy who they weren't necessarily counting on as part of their future core because of his age. And you can go up and down the roster, and you can say that for every single guy. You can say that for the coaching staff. You can say that on the front office. There almost isn't a scenario bad enough that it would reflect poorly on anyone within the organization. And to your point, that's sort of the ultimate leeway. That's the ultimate freedom this team gets to play with going into this series. All right, Alex, fifth and final question, most prevalent national narrative that is wrong or misunderstood about the Knicks. You go for it first.
If you asked me, I think it's that there's two ends of the spectrum with how the national media is viewing this Knicks team. And I don't think either of them are right. I think on one end, and this is like the extreme end, I can only really think of one person that is taking himself seriously, putting this claim out there on national airwaves. But the Max Kellerman stance that if the Knicks don't win a first round series this year, the season's a failure. Shut up, dude. Like that's not the case at all. Everything that the Knicks have accomplished so far this year is far and beyond what anybody thought it was going to be. And so to say that like, oh, a team that wasn't even supposed to make the play in this year needs to win a first round series or the season's a failure. I mean, you've moved the goalposts so far that they're off the field at that point. They're out in the parking lot. You can't do that. It's not genuine. It literally is just it's something to try to rile people up. And so that's one national narrative that I've heard. But the counter side to that is that it seems like a lot of national writers seem to kind of just be looking at this Knicks team almost as like a cutesy story. Like, oh, how nice. The Knicks made it back to the playoffs. Wow, that's great for their fans, whatever. And not really taking the whole thing too seriously. Like not thinking, oh, maybe the Knicks actually do have what it takes to make it to the next round. Maybe they can actually give a team like the Sixers a series. And I think that they could. I think that ultimately if they get in a series with the Sixers, they're probably going to lose. And this is, of course, assuming that they beat the Hawks, which I think is probably likely. But, if they make it out of the first round and they go to face a team like the Sixers, they could take that team to 6-7 games. And I wouldn't be surprised at all. And maybe in a weird 1999 Redux kind of world, they go full underdog and take them out in the second round and make it to the Eastern Conference Finals, maybe for a date with the Nets. I don't think it's entirely likely, but it also wouldn't surprise me based off how this team plays, how durable they've been, how like just in shape they are. Like they are going to be getting a pretty unprecedented 5 days of rest heading into these playoffs. So despite all those high minute totals and everything, nobody's really missed a beat the whole year. And with 5 days of rest leading into the playoffs, I don't really think they're going to miss a beat this time. And especially then if they can make quick work of the Hawks potentially, then, you're looking at a potential well-rested Knicks team facing the Sixers in round 2 too. I could maybe see it happening. I'm not going to go out there and say that it's probable, but I am certainly going to say it's possible. And for that reason, I think that the national media is kind of, in a way, sleeping on the Knicks. Although I won't say that they're like totally discounting them. It just seems like they're just kind of being treated as like this cute little story when it's really more than that. I think they're legitimately building a team that now going into this offseason could be like one star away from actual contention sooner than later. But what do you think as far as the worst national narrative about the Knicks, Gavin?
Yeah, I think it's repeatedly, and you hear this from really smart people. Like I haven't heard like Kevin Arnovitz said something along these lines. Bill Simmons, maybe some debate on him, but something along these lines that it's like Julius Randle and the Randleettes. And it's like, oh, look at the rest of their roster. Look what Randle brought to fruition with literally zero help. And to some extent, like, yeah, that's true. Julius has had an incredible season. He's put this team on his back more times than I can count. And there have been games where he's really the only credible option down the stretch in close matches. But this team is really, really good up and down. I said this at the beginning. I'll end with it as well. Third best team in the NBA in terms of net rating since April 1st. You don't get there with one guy if that guy's not LeBron James or Luka Doncic. And as good as Randle has been, he's not quite on that level. Derrick Rose, again, for 20, 30 games running, borderline all-star level play, insane efficiency, ridiculous shot making, has developed the league's most unstoppable one-handed push shot. RJ Barrett has turned himself to not just one of the best young three-point shooters in the league, to one of the best three-point shooters in basketball, period, which is totally unexpected and amazing. Emmanuel quickly has won them games multiple times this season. Reggie Bullock, credibly, you can say one of the best 3-and-D role players in the NBA, guarding the opponent's best player night in and night out, shooting over 40% from distance while doing it. Alec Burks, we already mentioned his contributions, a credible sixth man of the year candidate earlier in the season after missing some time with COVID and injuries, coming back and looking like it once again. Nerlens Noel, Taj Gibson holding the fort down. Noel, one of the best in the league, blocking shots, getting steals, making big plays around the rim. Gibson, one of the lowest or best rather defensive ratings of any player in the NBA. I can go on and on and on. The point is this team has substantial depth, not a lot of star power. It won't necessarily get them out of the first round, but this is not a one-man band by any means. This is a deep, competitive Knicks team that is probably going to have a heck of a first-round series against the Atlanta Hawks. And on that happy note, we will end this one. And you'll be seeing the Knicks and maybe more of us sometime soon. Tune into Locked On Knicks. Tune into everything Locked On NBA. Till next time, Gavin, Schall, Alex Wolfe. Peace out.